Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are taking, well, the ultimate shortcut, maybe, into the architecture of human identity. We're not here for just high-level platitudes about self-improvement. We're diving deep into the psychological nuts and bolts, really, of what makes you you.
Exactly.
We're tracing the necessary steps from basic self-control all the way, potentially, to transcendence.
Yeah,
Now, anyone who's pursued deep personal transformation knows it often feels, well, messy, doesn't it? Random, sometimes even accidental.
absolutely. It can feel chaotic.
But our extensive sources today argue pretty convincingly, I think, that this journey is anything but accidental. Psychological transformation, it seems, follows a fixed, predictable, and profoundly hierarchical developmental path.
That's absolutely right. And for us to really understand this kind of fixed map of growth, we have to start by clearing up, I think, the most crucial distinction right at the beginning.
Okay.
Our mission here is to distinguish the psychological manager, what we formally call the ego, from the identity content it manages, the self-concept.
Right, the doer versus the data.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
We're going to trace how the maturation of this, let's call it the managerial mechanism, leads eventually to this state of internal alignment or congruence, and then finally, that fascinating, almost paradoxical state of voluntary boundary dissolution, self-transcendence.
So let's start right there with those foundational definitions, because let's be honest, the word ego carries so much baggage in everyday talk.
Oh, definitely. Low.
We need the precise, formal, psychological model here to really ground this whole conversation.
Precisely. So when we talk about the ego in this specific context, we are definitely not talking about arrogance or anything like that.
Nope.
We mean the executive psychological mechanism.
Okay.
Think of it as like the highly trained CEO of your mind is responsible for immediate operational management, rational judgment, impulse control.
The day-to-day running of things.
Exactly. Its core operating principle is the reality principle. Its main job is to mediate. It has to juggle the impulsive drives and desires coming from, the I, the moral rules from the superego, and then figure out how to express them adaptively, safely in the actual world.
So it's the rational system.
Yes, it's the doer, the controller. It uses what psychologists call secondary process thinking, basically. Logical, realistic thinking aimed at solving problems.
Okay, so the ego is the processor, the operating system. If
Now-
that's the mechanism, what's the self-concept then? Is that just like my feeling of who I am?
It's more the structured content of that identity. The self-concept is like the database, all the knowledge you have about yourself, organized into a hopefully coherent structure.
Ah, okay.
And it operates under a totally different directive.
Yeah.
The consistency principle, its prime directive, if you like, is to maintain coherence, internal harmony, and alignment between its parts and your perceived experiences.
And you can break that down.
Yeah, we usually break it into 3 key bits. You've got the self-image, that's the descriptive part. I am tall, I am introverted, whatever attributes you think you have.
Just the facts as you see them.
Right. Then there's self-esteem, that's the evaluative bit, how you feel about those attributes. Good, bad, indifferent.
The judgment.
And finally, the ideal self. That's the aspirational standard, who you wish you were, who you're striving to become.
Okay, so we have the manager, the ego, and the staff handbook, maybe, the self-concept. What actually connects them? What makes this whole system work in a real person moving around?
That bridge is the absolutely crucial concept of agency. Or more specifically, the subjective experience of agency.
Agency.
Agency is like the cognitive scaffolding that makes you a reflexive entity.
Yeah.
It means you are, at the same time, the subject, the doer, relating to the ego's mechanism, the object, the concept, relating to the self-concept's content.
So I'm both doing and being observed by myself.
In a sense, yes. This continuous background feeling that you are the author, the initiator of your own actions, that's what validates the ego's power and grounds the whole identity structure in reality. Without that constant self-check of I meant to do that and it happened, the whole system starts to wobble.
Okay, let's really unpack that foundation then. If the ego's the manager and agency is the proof it's in charge, where does that proof start? What are the ego's most basic bottom-up tools for checking reality and feeling in control?
Right, starts really low level, almost physiological, pre-conscious even. The foundational tool is called the feeling of agency, or FOA.
FOA.
Yeah, and this is like a low-level, non-conceptual. Think of it as background buzz of control. It's that automatic, immediate sensation you get during a voluntary action that just confirms, yep, my body is moving exactly the way I intended it to. You don't think about it normally. It's just there.
Like reaching for a cup.
Exactly. You
Okay.
just reach. And the feeling that you did the reaching is the FOA.
And how is that feeling technically generated? This sounds like the comparator model territory, right? Predictive processing.
That's the one. It's actually a really elegant self-calibrating feedback loop. So when you decide to do something voluntarily, let's stick with picking up that cup, your brain generates the main motor command. But crucially, before that command zips off to your muscles, a copy of it, called the efference copy, is made. Think of it like a memo the brain sends to its own internal prediction department, the internal forward model.
So the brain literally tells itself what it's about to do and what that should feel like.
Precisely. The forward model uses that efference copy, that memo, to instantly predict the sensory consequences.
Yeah.
What should the movement feel like? What should it look like? When should my fingers touch the ceramic? All predicted.
Okay. And then?
Then, that prediction is compared, moment by moment, against the actual sensory feedback coming back from your body and the world. Vision, touch, proprioception.
And if there's a mismatch, if I say, knock the cup instead.
Ah, that's the key. The signal generated by any deviation, any difference between prediction and reality, is the prediction error.
Okay.
A prediction error is the system's little alarm bell. It basically says, hang on, the actual movement or sensation didn't match the memo. Therefore, I didn't fully cause this outcome, or something unexpected happened.
So that error signal is the feeling of non-agency or reduced agency.
Exactly. And that signal forces the system to update, to self-correct, to refine its internal models. This continuous prediction, comparison, correction loop establishes the self's dynamic integrity. And this whole process is the mechanistic underpinning, the instantiation of the ego's primary job, reality testing.
Wow. Okay. That connects the brain mechanics to psychological health really clearly. Because if that fundamental system breaks down...
The sense of self fragments. Absolutely. The failure of this foundational FOA system is... well, it's devastating. We see it starkly in conditions like schizophrenia. There, you often have dysfunction, maybe linked to hypoactivation of the default mode network, or DMN, where this self-boundary, this reality testing ability of the ego, is profoundly disrupted.
So the system can't tell me from not me properly.
Precisely. Because the ego can't reliably attribute actions or even thoughts to the self, the individual might misattribute their own inner monologue, for instance, to external voices, or feel like their actions are being controlled by an outside force. It's a core fragmentation rooted right there in a failure of the prediction error system.
That's the really basic, almost mechanical confirmation of agency. But agency clearly scales up, right? It goes from my finger move the mouse to I am the kind of person who can lead a team. How do we make that leap from the neural hum to these high-level meaning structures?
That's the crucial developmental step. We move from the automatic low-level FOA to the judgment of agency, or JOA.
JOA. Okay, different acronym.
Different level entirely. The JOA is a higher-level conceptual judgment. It's what you use for explicit, conscious attribution of authorship. When you sit back and reflect on something you did and consciously decide, yes, I was responsible for that success, or maybe, oof, that failure was mine. You're using the JOA.
So it's a thought process, not just a feeling.
Exactly. It's much more complex than the FOA. It brings in contextual knowledge, your past experiences, beliefs, social cues, and critically, your established self-concept.
So the higher level JOA uses the self-concept, that database of who I am, as a kind of reference manual to decide if an action fits me, if it counts as mine.
Perfectly put.
Yeah.
The low-level FOA gives you the raw reliability data, did my body do what I intended? Check. But the high-level JOA provides the meaning, the coherence, the story.
Okay.
The success of the FOA system lays the neurological groundwork, absolutely. But it's the JOA that really opens the door to what McAdams calls the motivated agent layer of identity. Our capacity to set complex, future-oriented goals based on a coherent idea of who we are and what we want.
Now, here's where, reading the sources, it got really interesting for me. And honestly, maybe a little unsettling. The idea that this higher-level JOA system can actually override the immediate reality signal coming from the basic FOA. Why would the ego evolve a mechanism that can essentially choose to ignore a prediction error? Choose consistency over immediate reality? That sounds dodgy.
It sounds dodgy, but it's key to psychological stability, especially in a complex world. The JOA can indeed override minor failures registered by the FOA. Let's take your example. You reach for your water bottle, but maybe you fumble it slightly, your fingers brush against it unexpectedly. That registers a small FOA prediction error. Objectively, the action wasn't perfectly smooth.
Right.
But the ego, which is strongly driven by the consistency principle of the self-concept, activates the JOA and attributes the overall action picking up the bottle to the self anyway. Why?
Because I'm the kind of person who picks up water bottles competently.
Exactly. The established self-concept says, I am generally competent at simple motor tasks. So the minor error gets minimized, maybe rationalized away. Oh, the table's a bit sticky, or I was distracted for a second. The JOA smooths it over.
Wait a minute, isn't this mechanism prioritizing internal coherence, my story about myself, over the objective, immediate sensorimotor data? Isn't that basically a form of self-deception?
Well, in minor everyday cases, yes, you could frame it that way. But it functions more like a psychological buffer. It's functionally very similar to a proactive, high-level ego defense mechanism. It guards against the constant noise of everyday inconsistencies.
Okay.
Think about it. If the ego had to fully process and integrate every single tiny prediction error, every slightly misjudged step or fumbled word, the self-concept would be in constant flux. The energy needed just to maintain a stable sense of self would be astronomical.
Right, you'd be constantly revising who you are based on trivial mistakes.
Exactly. So the JOA acts as a stabilizer. It ensures the identity structure remains reasonably coherent and stable despite these minor disruptions. It essentially protects the motivated agent's ability to keep pursuing longer-term goals without getting bogged down in momentary imperfections. It shows the ego's initial structural bias towards coherence, even if it means filtering reality slightly.
That stabilization makes sense, but it also sounds like it requires constant effort, like a background process that's always running, potentially draining resources.
It is the ultimate executive function, and yes, it requires energy. Which brings us directly to the mechanical limit of this whole system. Ego strength and depletion.
Ah, ego depletion. We hear a lot about that.
Right. According to the strength model of self-control, which is pretty well supported, any volitional act initiating something new, making a tough choice, focusing your attention, overriding an impulse, or even just maintaining that top-down JOA coherence against contradictory evidence requires a finite executive resource, like mental fuel.
And when that fuel tank runs low, the ego sputters.
Correct. You enter ego depletion. It's a state of mental fatigue where the ego's capacity to uphold that identity structure, to exert self-control, and to sustain intentional behavior just plummets.
Okay.
And since agency is the engine for the motivated agent's future goals, depletion represents a systemic failure of the ego. It's like a CEO who's completely burned out, their strategic judgment goes out the window, and they start making impulsive, short-sighted decisions or just give up.
You mentioned earlier that the type of goal we pursue matters here. What kind of efforts are particularly draining on this ego strength?
Yeah, the research, particularly work related to goal pursuit, hypothesizes that pursuing avoidance goals is especially depleting.
Avoidance goals, as in trying not to do something.
Exactly. Instead of focusing your resources on achieving a positive outcome like, I will go for a run 3 times this week, avoidance goals are focused on not doing something undesirable. I must not eat any cake. I must not check my phone during this meeting.
Why is that harder?
Because it requires continuous vigilance and suppression. You have to constantly monitor for the unwanted thought or urge and then actively inhibit it. It's like holding a beach ball underwater. It takes constant effort. Approach goals, aiming towards something positive, tend to be less resource intensive.
So constantly trying to avoid things just wears down your self-control faster.
It seems to, yes. This chronic negative monitoring drains that self-regulatory capacity much more quickly, which confirms that the basic mechanical strength of the ego is a fundamental limiter on our ability to pursue goals and ultimately to transform. If the engine is always depleted, you simply don't have the horsepower for the higher level work of personal growth.
Okay, so let's try and synthesize this foundational layer, this sort of mechanical architecture of the self. We start with the FOA, the feeling of agency, providing that basic bottom-up reality testing data.
Raw data.
Then the JOA, the judgment of agency, acts as a top-down filter, using the self-concept to smooth things out and maintain coherence.
The stabilizing interpretation layer.
And the whole system runs on ego strength, which sustains the motivated agent's ability to pursue goals. But this strength is finite, and depletion leads to a breakdown in coherence and control.
That's a great map of the foundation. Once we have that structure built and understand how it's sustained and how it can fail, Then we can really turn to the developmental process itself. How does this machinery mature?
Exactly. Now that we've got a handle on the ego's cognitive machinery and its, well, mechanical limitations, we really need to talk about the developmental path. Because high-level self-transformation, the kind people aspire to, it's just fundamentally impossible until the ego has climbed some rungs on the developmental ladder. It needs a certain level of structural complexity and strength first.
Right, there's a developmental imperative, as you called it.
Yes, it's not just about having the machinery, it's about that machinery maturing.
This sounds like the shift from just being an actor, reacting to the world, maybe like a young child does, to becoming a conscious agent who thinks about the future and shapes it. That's precisely the transition Dan McAdams talks about. The ego's development really comes into focus when we look at the second layer of personality he describes, the motivated agent.
Okay.
This layer typically starts emerging around ages 5 to 7. It coincides with the child's growing ability for rational thought, planning, and self-control. Agency transforms here. It's no longer just about basic sensory-motor control, I can move my hand.
Yeah.
It becomes a robust psychological belief structure that's necessary for self-regulating towards future goals.
So the child starts seeing themselves as someone who has goals and plans.
Exactly. The individual now understands themselves as having conscious motivations, agendas, values, intentions, things that orient them across time into the future. They're not just living moment to moment.
And to map this maturation process in detail, we often rely on Jane Loevinger's work, right? Her stages of ego development. How does the self-concept itself change as the ego matures through those early Loevinger stages?
Loevinger's model is fantastic for this. She saw the ego as a master trait or a process that matures through a fixed sequence of stages, each marked by increasing impulse control and, crucially, greater conceptual complexity.
So what are the early stages like?
In the earliest stages, like the impulsive or self-protective stages, Loevinger called them E2 and E3, the self-concept is extremely rigid and very externally driven. Reality is interpreted in simplistic black and white terms, usually focused on immediate needs and concrete consequences, reward versus punishment.
My needs matter most, and bad things happen because other people are bad.
Pretty much. Conflict is almost always seen as external. Blame is projected outwards. There's very little capacity for introspection or seeing shades of gray.
Okay. And then we often see people move into the conformist stage. This feels very familiar, maybe adolescence or even early career stages for some, that rule-following phase.
It is structurally crucial, yes, but often profoundly rigid. At the conformist stage, the self-image becomes heavily, almost entirely, defined by external factors, group norms, social expectations, stereotypes, what people like us do or think.
Fitting in is everything.
Absolutely. The ego is driven by a powerful need to belong, to be accepted, and this results in a very low tolerance for ambiguity, for difference, for internal contradiction. Anything that doesn't fit the group's mold feels threatening.
So how does the ego handle experiences that don't fit the mold?
It has to rely heavily on defenses like denial or distortion. If the individual has an experience or an impulse that contradicts the accepted group norms or their rigid self-concept, the conformist ego often just blocks it out, rationalizes it away, or reinterprets it to fit. It literally lacks the cognitive complexity to hold contradictory ideas simultaneously. Complexity threatens its simple, rule-based operating manual.
So the ego at this conformist stage is highly protective of its social standing, maybe, but it's functionally quite fragile because it depends on filtering out or twisting reality.
That's a great way to put it. It achieves its sense of consistency only through cognitive limitation, through simplification. The critical question for development then becomes, how does a person break out of this cycle of rigidity? How do they move towards a structure that allows for genuine internal complexity, for authenticity, for integrating the messy bits?
That requires a significant cognitive leap, presumably.
A massive leap. Which brings us to Loevinger's higher stages, particularly the crucial autonomous stage, E8.
E8, okay. What defines this really profound cognitive shift? What makes an ego autonomous?
The hallmark of the autonomous ego is a dramatically heightened capacity to acknowledge, tolerate, and even cope constructively with inner conflicts.
Inner conflicts, like what?
Like recognizing that you can hold seemingly opposing needs or values within yourself at the same time. For example, the deep need for intimate connection versus the equally strong need for independence and autonomy. Or wanting stability, but also craving novelty.
The conformist ego would try to pick one and deny the other.
Exactly. Or project one onto someone else. The autonomous ego, however, stops trying to eliminate or deny the conflict. It starts trying to integrate it, to find a way to honor both sides of the polarity.
And the structural requirement for that must be a much higher tolerance for things not being simple or clear-cut.
Absolutely. The defining psychological feature here is a high tolerance for ambiguity and conceptual complexity. The autonomous ego is finally capable of embracing polarity, holding multiple perspectives simultaneously, and integrating ideas or feelings that were previously seen as mutually exclusive or contradictory.
The world is no longer black and white.
Not at all. The ego's focus shifts away from rigid adherence to external rules or group approval, moving towards deeper, more authentic issues of self-fulfillment, personal values, and genuine individuality.
So if the ego manages to reach this level of maturity, this E8 structure, it sounds like it's finally developed the structural capacity to handle real authenticity, warts and all.
That's the perfect way to frame it. Achieving autonomous maturity, E8, is, according to the models we're looking at, the non-negotiable cognitive prerequisite for reaching what Carl Rogers called self-actualization.
Why prerequisite?
Because Rogers argued that psychological tension, distress, what he called incongruence, arises precisely because the rigid pre-autonomous ego has to rely on distortion or denial. It has to suppress experiences that threaten its simpler, often socially defined self-concept.
Right.
But the cognitive flexibility and the complexity tolerance that are inherent in the E8 structure mean that internal contradictions, difficult feelings, complex realities, they're no longer fundamentally threatening to the integrity of the self.
Because the self is now complex enough to hold them.
Exactly. This is the first developmental structure that is capable of accepting and integrating complex, authentic, organismic experiences, the real felt sense of being, without needing to defensively push them away or twist them into something they're not.
So achieving autonomous maturity is structurally necessary to even have a shot at Rogers' state of congruence. Okay, so once the ego hits that autonomous capacity, E8, and it can actually tolerate its own inner complexity without freaking out, that opens the door to what many consider the psychological peak, self-actualization. This feels like a shift from just managing a coherent identity to achieving a fully congruent one. Is that right?
That's absolutely the mastery phase. Self-actualization really marks the culmination of effective ego management and self-concept coherence working together. And when we focus on Carl Rogers' framework, congruence is essentially his definition of the fully functioning person.
And what does congruence mean specifically?
It's achieved when there's a close functional alignment, minimal gap between three key aspects of your identity.
Yeah.
Your self-image, who you currently think you are, your ideal self, who you aspire to be, and your actual organismic experiences, the deep, often non-conscious, gut-level reality of your feelings, needs, and reactions in the moment.
So my thoughts, my aspirations, and my actual feelings are all singing from the same hymn sheet, more or less.
Pretty much, yes. They're in harmony. There isn't a huge, stressful gap between the person you present to the world and yourself, and the person you genuinely feel yourself to be underneath.
Now, you mentioned earlier that incongruence, that gap, requires chronic energy expenditure, defenses, distortions.
A massive amount, yes.
So achieving congruence must offer an incredible energetic payoff, right?
It's probably the single biggest productivity gain you can get in the self-system. Think about the pre-congruent person, maybe someone stuck at the conformist or even the self-aware stage. Their mind is like a constantly warring committee meeting.
Yeah.
They're spending chronic energy managing internal conflicts, maintaining defenses against uncomfortable truths, mediating between the often unrealistic ideal self and the perceived flaws of the self-image, twisting sensory input to fit the consistency principle. It's exhausting.
And when congruence is finally achieved, or at least approached,
that chronic psychic load is dramatically reduced. The ego is no longer primarily tasked with aggressively defending a fragile, distorted, or overly simplistic structure. It can operate with profound efficiency because the internal components are aligned, they're integrated.
So it's like upgrading the operating system to run smoothly without constant background battles.
Exactly. And all that freed up executive resource, all the energy previously spent on internal fighting, denial, impression management, it becomes instantly available. It can be redirected towards higher-level psychological pursuits, creativity, deeper relationships, tackling complex problems, contributing to the community, genuine self-fulfillment, and generativity. The integrity of the self-concept, now defined by congruence, becomes the ultimate sign of a highly integrated, efficient ego mechanism.
But life throws curveballs. The real world is chaotic.
Mhm.
How does a resilient ego maintain this state of congruence when faced with inevitable failures, setbacks, major prediction errors?
Yeah, congruence isn't a static state you achieve and then just rest. It has to be actively maintained, and that requires continuous ego resilience.
Okay, resilience. How is that defined here?
Resilience, in this context, is the ability to respond effectively and adaptively when goals get thwarted, when those major prediction errors do occur, or when life just delivers a massive unexpected blow.
So it's about bouncing back.
It's more than just bouncing back, it's about how you interpret the setback. A resilient, agentic individual tends to process external failures not as a fundamental indictment of their core identity, see, I am a failure, but more as temporary, often external setbacks that require strategic adjustment or learning.
They don't let it shatter their self-concept.
Exactly. They manage to maintain a continuous, generally positive, but also realistic narrative about themselves and their ability to cope and move forward. The congruent self is flexible enough to integrate the failure without collapsing.
This sounds like it requires fundamentally different coping mechanisms than the earlier stages. You can't maintain congruence through denial, presumably.
No, absolutely not. The shift in the type of defense mechanisms used is a hallmark of this maturity. The mature, congruent ego relies far less on those primitive, image-distorting defenses we talked about, like projection. It's not my fault, it's theirs. Splitting, seeing things as all good or all bad, or outright denial. Those defenses consume huge psychic energy and fundamentally distort reality.
So what does it use instead?
It utilizes mature adaptive defenses, things like humor, anticipation, planning for potential problems, altruism, and the classic one is sublimation.
Sublimation.
Yeah, channeling potentially problematic impulses or intense emotional energy into socially valuable, constructive, and often creative activities. Think of someone channeling aggressive energy into competitive sports, or deep angst into powerful art or writing.
So it's about transforming the energy, not just blocking it.
Precisely. This shift towards mature defenses confirms the ego has matured enough to prioritize objective reality and constructive problem-solving over simply protecting a fragile or idealized self-image at all costs.
Okay, so self-actualization, characterized by congruence, resilience, and mature defenses, seems to align perfectly with Loevinger's highest stage before transcendence, the integrated stage, E9. This is the peak state of psychological integration, wisdom, making peace with life's complexities.
That's the picture, yes. E9 represents the apex of effective ego management and integrated selfhood. But interestingly, this isn't necessarily the end of the developmental journey described in some models.
Right, because now comes the most fascinating and maybe the most counterintuitive part of the journey we mapped out. Self-transcendence, the intentional act of moving beyond the self-focused ego.
Yes, the integrated stage, E9, represents that peak of psychological health, maximum congruence, highly effective executive function. But it's from this position of strength that the possibility of the final destination arises. Self-transcendence, or ST.
And this involves moving towards, what? Something beyond personal well-being.
Towards things like collective identification, profound altruism, a sense of connection to something larger than the individual self, and sometimes a voluntary, temporary dissolution of those tight, egocentric boundaries. And this immediately introduces the central paradox of the whole transformation journey.
Which is, you have to be perfectly whole, perfectly strong before you can choose to become, in a sense, less defined, less separate.
Precisely stated. Self-transcendence, as understood in these models, requires the intentional, safe dissolution of egocentric boundaries. But this act absolutely must be preceded by a strong, fully integrated, functionally mature ego, that E9 level of functioning. The strength of the ego is the non-negotiable prerequisite for its safe, temporary relinquishment.
Why? Why is that structural strength so critical? Why can't someone with, say, an immature, maybe self-protective ego, E3, just decide to bypass all the hard work and try to transcend their ego? People talk about ego death experiences, sometimes induced.
Because the ego, as we've established, acts as the center of consciousness. It's responsible for maintaining boundaries, testing reality, organizing experience. Now, if we look at this from a Jungian perspective, for example, confronting the deep contents of the unconscious, which is arguably necessary for profound integration or any genuine transcendent experience with a weak ego, is incredibly dangerous.
It's dangerous. How?
A weak, poorly integrated ego lacks the executive capacity, the resilience, the sheer structural integrity to hold the tension and process the often overwhelming, non-rational, symbolic content that can emerge from the unconscious or during altered states. It risks being flooded, overwhelmed.
Brain do.
Potentially severe psychological disintegration, psychotic breaks, or kind of pathological fusion where the person gets lost in the unconscious material without differentiation. The integrated ego, E9, needs to be robust enough to serve as the necessary witness, the stable platform, the container. It needs to be in conscious control of the dissolution process rather than being fragmented by it.
So true strength isn't about building impenetrable walls around the self forever. It's about developing the perfect structural integrity and control necessary to voluntarily lower the drawbridge, explore beyond the castle walls, and then safely raise it again when needed.
That's a beautiful analogy, yes. So how do we model this safe, volitional boundary flexibility in terms of cognitive mechanics?
Yeah, how does that work?
For a potential mechanism, we can turn to Julius Kuhl's personality systems interaction theory. It offers a really fascinating mechanistic way to think about this highest level of intrapsychic integration, which he actually terms ego-transcendence.
Ego-transcendence, okay.
Kuhl suggests our self-regulation operates through two primary, often competing functional systems within the personality.
Okay, what are they?
First, there's the explicit system. This aligns pretty well with what we've been calling the ego. It's analytical, conscious, logical, sequential, very focused on future-oriented planning and goal execution. Kuhl links this to what he calls intention memory, like your mental to-do list, your explicit plans, your step-by-step reasoning.
The rational planner. Got it.
Second, there's the implicit system. This aligns more with the holistic self. It's non-analytic, more intuitive, parallel processing, strongly based in emotions and bodily feelings. It stores vast amounts of highly integrated, self-congruent autobiographical information, the deep, felt sense of who you are, your values, your complex experiences. Kuhl calls this extension memory.
Okay, so the explicit planner and the implicit deep self database. And often they might be disconnected or even in conflict.
Very often, yes. There can be a functional barrier between them. We might have conscious intentions, explicit system, that are completely out of sync with our deep feelings or values, implicit system, leading to internal conflict or self-sabotage.
Right. So Kuhl's ego transcendence is overcoming that barrier.
Yes, mechanically, it's defined as the ability to overcome the functional separation between these two systems. It's the deliberate, fluid integration of the two. And functionally, Kuhl proposes this is achieved through the developed ability to willfully switch between the highly analytical, focused mode, ego explicit, and the more holistic, open, receptive mode, self-implicit, of information processing.
Willfully switch.
The ego transcendence Kuhl describes isn't about the ego disappearing. It's about the subjective experience of being able to access and integrate the deep wisdom and coherence of the implicit self-system without the analytical system constantly needing to dominate, critique, censor, or control it.
What's absolutely crucial here, then, is that this is not passive surrender. It's not about being overwhelmed by the implicit. It sounds like an act of choice, demanding supreme cognitive flexibility.
It is arguably the highest application of volitional control and ego strength. It requires that the highly integrated individual retains the executive capacity for complex analytic thought. The strong ego structure is still there, while simultaneously choosing to access, trust, and integrate the non-rational, implicit, holistic content emerging from the self-system.
Wow.
So true self-transcendence in this model is an act of supreme volitional control that temporarily relinquishes the narrow focus of the egocentric viewpoint while meticulously retaining overall executive management and the ability to return to analytical processing when needed.
Okay, that structural ability, the strong ego that can choose to switch between analytical control and holistic feeling, that allows us to finally make sense of Carl Jung's concept of the transcendent function, doesn't it?
It maps onto it beautifully, I think.
So what happens to the sense of agency, the feeling of authorship, when that switch gets flipped, when the barrier is overcome?
Right, the transcendent function for Jung was this natural psychic process that dialectically integrates conscious, ego, and unconscious self-contents, ideally leading to a synthesis, a new third position, and an evolution of the personality. For this to happen effectively and consciously, the integrated ego must do something quite radical. It needs to intentionally suspend, or at least relax, its core function of narrow authorship attribution, that JOA we talked about, which normally defends the tight boundary of the individual self.
If the JOA, the I did that, this is mine filter, is temporarily suspended or broadened, then my identification, my sense of who is doing this, must expand beyond my skin, right?
Precisely. When Kuhl's functional barrier between the explicit planning system and the implicit holistic system is overcome, that narrow self-referential boundary maintained by the typical JOA can dissolve or become porous. The strong ego allows this shift without panic. The individual can then shift their felt sense of authorship from exclusive self-causation. I achieved that success, I had that insight, towards a more collective, participatory, or even non-self sense of authorship. The process unfolded, the insight arose, we achieved this together, or even the universe acted through me.
Wow.
This fundamental redefining of agency, moving from sole individual ownership to a more holistic or transpersonal identification, is arguably the core cognitive mechanism underlying the experiences of profound altruism, deep empathy, feelings of universal connectedness, and the unity of consciousness often reported in transcendent states.
Okay, so let's try and synthesize this whole dramatic developmental arc then. We start way back with the impulsive or self-protective ego, E2, E3, focused purely on short-term survival, immediate needs, external rewards, and punishment.
Very basic, reactive.
Then we mature, hopefully through conformist stages towards the conscientious or maybe self-aware agent around E6, E7, focused on longer-term goals, internal standards, social roles, planning.
Building structure and competence.
Then comes the big leap to the autonomous E8 and integrated E9 stages, achieving self-actualization characterized by internal congruence, high tolerance for complexity, mature defenses, maximum operational efficiency of the ego.
Peak individual functioning.
And finally, from that peak of integrated strength comes the possibility of self-transcendence, post-E9, which involves using that strength to willfully overcome intrapsychic barriers like Kuhl's explicit-implicit divide, leading to an expansion of agency and identification beyond the individual self.
That hierarchy really demonstrates that psychological development isn't random. It's a rigorous structure, built layer upon layer. The strongest, most stable foundation is required to support the capacity for the highest, most integrated, and potentially most transpersonal forms of consciousness.
Okay, let's bring these sometimes very high-level theories back down to earth a bit. Thinking about daily life, mental health, clinical practice, what happens when these mechanisms fail? Or, maybe more commonly, when they just get stuck at an immature developmental stage?
Right, because pathology from this developmental perspective is often fundamentally a failure of this ego-self structure to either operate efficiently or to successfully transition to the next more complex developmental level. We can actually map many clinical failures directly onto the breakdown of these foundational cognitive mechanisms we've discussed.
Okay, so starting right at the bottom, again, that basic FOA failure, the breakdown and the feeling of agency we talked about with schizophrenia.
That's probably the deepest level of mechanical breakdown in this system. As we said, in conditions like schizophrenia, the dysfunction in the brain's predictive coding means the ego literally cannot reliably parse self-generated movements or even thoughts. The comparator system is faulty.
Leading to the misattributions.
Exactly. Distributing internal actions or thoughts to external agents resulting in hallucinations, delusions of control, or thought insertion. It's a catastrophic failure of that bottom-up reality testing and fundamental self-other boundary maintenance.
Okay, what about problems higher up? When the ego gets developmentally stuck, maybe trapped in that phase, where it aggressively prioritizes internal consistency, that consistency principle, way above objective reality, the reality principle, using those less mature defenses.
That pattern forms the foundation of many personality pathologies, particularly those rooted in the chronic, rigid reliance on maladaptive defenses. Think about narcissistic personality disorder, for instance.
Okay.
The individual, in that case, seems stuck rigidly maintaining an idealized, grandiose, but often highly fragile self-image. They have to aggressively use image-distorting defenses, constant denial of flaws, grandiosity, projection of negativity onto others, entitlement to protect that specific self-image at all costs.
So they're prioritizing the consistency of their chosen self-story above everything else.
Absolutely. Above objective truth, above the impact on others, above genuine self-reflection. It represents, in this framework, a catastrophic failure to make that crucial developmental transition from the conformist-like need for coherence through distortion towards the integrated state, E9, that achieves congruence through reality-based integration and complexity tolerance.
And linking back again to the basic mechanics, the fuel tank issue, ego depletion, how does that manifest clinically?
Well, chronic poor self-regulation, the inability to manage impulses, stick to plans, or resist temptations, that's often underpinned by chronic resource exhaustion, by ego depletion. It's a massive limiter.
Yeah.
This instability leads directly to difficulty sustaining goal-directed behavior. We see it clearly in relapse patterns, in addictive behaviors, procrastination, difficulty managing emotions, general life instability. The sources we looked at really confirm that basic mechanical ego strength is a primary limiter of psychological transformation and stability. If you are chronically depleted, maybe by pursuing those avoidance goals we talked about, or by constant internal conflict from incongruence, you literally do not have the basic kinetic energy required to climb Loevinger's developmental ladder towards integration and autonomy.
So if we think about therapeutic interventions, the implication is that you have to start by strengthening the basic executive functions first. You can't jump straight to congruence work if the foundations are shaky.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Therapy needs to be developmentally staged, or at least address the foundational levels first. The initial focus, particularly for individuals struggling with significant instability or personality issues, must often be on reinforcing the ego's core executive functions.
Like what?
Building basic self-regulation capacity, impulse control, emotional regulation skills, improving reality testing by gently challenging cognitive distortions, reducing the reliance on those primitive image-distorting defenses, and maybe fostering more adaptive coping strategies. You're essentially trying to build a more robust, functional agentic capacity first.
Bolstering the manager's office.
Exactly, before you ask it to undertake major corporate restructuring.
Okay. And then for clients who are perhaps already pretty functional day to day, but are actively seeking deeper self-actualization, maybe feeling that incongruence. Rogers talked about how does therapy facilitate that potential leap towards the autonomous stage?
There, the aim shifts more explicitly towards facilitating congruence. And this is often achieved by helping enhance the ego's capacity to tolerate complexity, ambiguity, and difficult internal experiences, essentially supporting the movement toward the autonomous stage.
E8. How do you do that?
Client-centered approaches, pioneered by Rogers himself, are really vital here. Techniques emphasizing therapist empathy, unconditional positive regard, genuineness, deep listening, they create a safe psychological environment.
Safe for what?
Safe for the client to begin exploring and integrating those authentic, sometimes challenging or previously denied organismic experiences into their self-concept, without feeling the overwhelming need to immediately distort them or push them away defensively.
So acceptance allows integration.
Precisely. And by promoting a robust but flexible sense of agency, the therapist can also help the client reframe setbacks or failures, seeing them as valuable external feedback or learning opportunities, rather than as fundamental threats to their identity. This fosters that lasting resilience needed to maintain congruence in a messy world.
Okay, one last piece. We've talked a lot about these underlying cognitive mechanisms, EVOA, JOA, the comparator model, Loevinger stages, Cool's systems, and implied they're pretty universal to human psychology.
The evidence suggests the basic structures are, yes.
But the content of our self-concept, our ideal self, how we interpret transcendence, that's obviously heavily influenced by our surroundings. What's the role of culture in this whole developmental picture?
That's a crucial distinction. The underlying structure seems fixed. The content is highly fluid and culturally shaped, while the basic mechanisms, the need for agency, the drive for consistency, the stages of ego development seem to be universal human potentials. The specific goals of transformation are heavily molded by culture.
What kind of goals?
What constitutes the ideal self in a given society? What aspirations for spiritual integration are valued? And importantly, how are experiences of transcendence, if they occur, interpreted and labeled? All of that is deeply shaped by cultural narratives, values, and frameworks. Culture essentially informs the teleology, the final accepted end goal of psychological transformation within that context.
So everyone might have the latent psychological capacity for something like Cool's ego transcendence, that intrapsychic integration of explicit and implicit systems, but culture dictates whether they interpret that experience as, say, mystical union or psychological integration or something else entirely.
That's a very good way to put it. Culture acts almost like a higher-level JOA filter for these profound subjective experiences. It provides the frames, the labels, the meaning-making structure. For example, that experience of overcoming the implicit barrier might be interpreted and labeled within certain cultural or religious frameworks as enlightenment, satori, cosmic consciousness, or a mystical experience, maybe drawing on something like the interactive religious experience model, IRM, which looks at cognitive biases and cultural scripts. In a more secular context, it might be framed as peak experience, flow state, or deep psychological integration.
So culture influences the aspirational targets and the interpretation, but the underlying psychological structure needed the strong E9 ego capable of safe, volitional integration remains the constant prerequisite for effective transformation, regardless of label.
Exactly. The mechanics seem universal. The meaning-making is contextual.
Yeah.
So if we were to summarize this entire deep dive, this whole journey of the self, it really is strictly hierarchical, isn't it? It starts with the basic mechanical certainty of the feeling of agency, FOA, which provides the essential bottom-up data for the ego's reality testing function.
Right, the ground floor.
Then maturity progresses, ideally through Loevinger's stages, until the autonomous ego, E8, is achieved. That stage grants the crucial conceptual complexity needed to finally move beyond defensive distortion and tolerate inner conflict.
Opening the door for
Self-Actualization, E9, which is that peak state of effective ego management, characterized by high congruence between self-image, ideal self, and real experience. It's the state of maximal integration and efficiency.
And only from that position of strength.
Only from that robust E9 structure is it really safe and possible to execute the intentional temporary dissolution of strict egocentric boundaries, which mechanistically might involve voluntarily overcoming that barrier between the analytic ego and the holistic self, like in Kuhl's ego transcendence.
And this final act, maybe facilitated by something like Jung's transcendent function, allows for an expansion of the sense of authorship and agency beyond the individual self, culminating potentially in states of holistic consciousness or transpersonal connection. It really does resolve that central paradox beautifully. The ego must first achieve its peak executive strength, stability, and integration, so that it has the capacity, by its own volition, to choose to temporarily dissolve its own self-centered constraints without collapsing or fragmenting. The ultimate act of self-mastery might just be the conscious, controlled choice to relinquish the self when appropriate.
Indeed, a powerful culmination.
Which leaves us with a final, perhaps provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over. If the core psychological function of that mature, autonomous ego is the ability to tolerate complexity and integrate conflicting truths without automatically resorting to denial or distortion, what aspect of your life right now may be a difficult emotion, a challenging relationship dynamic, a frustrating failure, an inconvenient truth about yourself are you currently, perhaps subtly, blocking out, minimizing, or externalizing because accepting it fully might threaten your established self-concept? What is the ongoing energetic cost of maintaining that particular incongruence?
And looking forward, that line of thinking also points toward the critical next steps for research in this field. Our sources strongly suggest that future work really needs to focus on empirically validating the neurocognitive basis of models like Kuhl's. If supreme psychological integration truly involves this developed ability to willfully switch between analytical, explicit ego and holistic implicit self-processing systems, what does that actually look like in the brain?
Can we see that switching mechanism?
That's the hope. Future inquiry should really try to map the dynamic, functional connectivity, how different brain networks talk to each other, specifically between the executive control networks associated with the ego-explicit system and the self-referential processing networks, like the DMN, associated with the self-implicit system, especially in highly integrated, self-actualized, or perhaps even transcendent adults. That is likely where we will find the neurological signature of this profound psychological integration we've been discussing today.